Maybe he couldn't remember because he'd never actually had one before. Saturday morning, their parents did something they hadn't done in years. They let Alec and Hazel sleep for as long as they wanted. Hazel woke up much earlier than Alec, but she chose to stay in her room, playing quietly until Alec finally got up at 9 o'clock. As soon as his bed springs creaked and he rose to sit on the edge of his bed, he heard Hazel's soft footsteps padding from her bedroom to his. The bathroom door creaked open, and she entered his room with a casualness that would have been unheard of 7 days ago. "Big day," Alex said, studying her face for a reaction. He'd expected excitement or smugness, maybe even a twinge of guilt at all the torture they'd put their parents through, a sort of practice she wasn't accustomed to, no matter how much she had decided she wanted to be a little less golden. He didn't see any of that in her face, though. He saw the usual evenly spaced freckles, the wide light green eyes, the perfect blonde ringlets that haloed her head. But there was something else. It was impossible to believe it was anything other than abject sadness. "You're about to get everything you want," he said, scrutinizing her, but she gave nothing away. "Yup," she said, though it was clear she didn't agree. "You know, after this, you can probably go back to being nice, and they'll totally forgive you," he said. He, on the other hand, could go back to being his usual rotten self after this, and he'd receive 0 credit for having been decent to his family for the last week. "Yeah, you're probably right," she said, taking a seat on the carpet beside his bed. As she started to pick at the lint in the rug, Alex started to wonder if that's what she wanted, to go back to being the good one. And he was surprised to find that regardless of what she wanted, that was what he wanted. All this plotting and counterplotting was getting exhausting. He thought he could outplay his sister and protect his status as the bad egg, and maybe he still could. But what was it all for anyway? So he could keep himself exiled on his own little island in the house? Had it really been that bad hanging out with her for the last week? She started to stand up and walk toward the door, avoiding eye contact with Alec, and he found himself saying what he said next without even thinking. "Happy birthday," he said, and this time she did turn to look at him, and she smiled. He thought it was real. He didn't want to think it was anything other than that. This morning had been very confusing. The party was all the belly-controlled chaos it had been in previous years. Kids standing on chairs, rubbing balloons on one another's heads to create static. Parents calling out, "Where's Jimmy? Has anyone seen Jimmy?" Freddy Fazbear's staff expertly sidestepping spilt orange drink and fielding requests for more ranch dressing. Amid the chaos, Alec could see 1 or 2 kids from the party walking around the restaurant with a 2-foot lonely Freddy in tow. It might have been cute if it hadn't been so creepy, watching this not quite tall but not quite short bear follow its friend around, listening and waiting for cues before acting unautonomously, and Aunt Gigi's comment may have rung a little too true for Alec's comfort. But that day, he saw that truth in all its boldness. The kids who played too rough, whose noses crusted around the nostrils, whose faces twisted into sour frowns, were the ones followed by the bears and no one else. Hazel wasn't quite the golden Hazel she'd been in previous years, but she was more or less back to her old self. She politely thanked her friends for buying her the gifts she acted like she wasn't expecting. She helped her mom pass cake around to all the guests and her parents before taking a bite herself. She spent equal time with each kid who attended, making sure not to let anyone feel left out as they breezed from game to game in the arcade. Alex sat in the corner and played his role of the sulking, teenaged older brother. By all rights, if he'd wanted one, he easily could have earned his own lonely Freddy. In a strange turn of events, his parents seemed relieved to see everything return to its normal, inadequate existence. Whereas, in previous years, they would have been urging him to go play with his sister, nudging him to smile, prodding him to help them drag the presents to the car. This year, they seemed just fine, with allowing him to slouch in a chair and scowl at the partygoers. "I think it's all going pretty well, don't you?" his dad asked his mom and Aunt Gigi. "Did anyone remind the staff that Charlotte can't have chocolate?" "I should probably go remind them," his mom said. "It's going great," Aunt Gigi said, casting a sideways look at Alec, who simply shrugged. Actually, it was going great. His sister was once again recognizable to their parents. The party only had an hour left until things were to wind down, and no one had gotten injured or poisoned. All in all, a notable success. Except it wasn't a success. Alec hadn't been able to play his trump card yet, and he hadn't been able to play it because Hazel wasn't playing her part anymore. She'd done everything. Played skee-ball, fought zombies in the virtual reality battleground, shot about 1,000,000 baskets, watched 2 full performances of the Freddy Fazbear Band. Yet every time the party prepper had come into the room trying to convince her to head over to the wind tunnel to snag the coupon for her prize, she found a reason not to go in. Instead, she'd look toward Alec, as though in some sort of silent standoff, and say to the party prepper, "I don't know if I want to do that anymore." "But honey, that's all you've been talking about for weeks, is trying to win Yog Foxy," their mom would say, but every time she would blow the party prepper off and run away to play some other game with her friends. Aunt Gigi shrugged. Maybe she doesn't want it anymore. Kids are fickle. Alec had been so prepared. He'd snuck away when nobody was looking. He'd sifted through 3 full buckets of coupons, tickets, and confetti, until at last he'd found the single Yog Foxy ticket in the materials meant for the wind tunnel. He pocketed the coupon and gone about his sulking way, and no one was the wiser. But if Hazel wasn't going to take her turn in the wind tunnel, it was all for nothing. Alec realized if he was going to expose her for the brat she was, he was going to have to take a more active role than he had been taking. "Maybe she's afraid of being disappointed," he said to his mom, and his mom seemed to think that was a pretty reasonable idea. "Alec, you two have been getting along so famously lately. Maybe you should try to convince her. I'm just afraid she's going to leave today and regret not even trying." "Sure thing, Mom," Alex said, laying it on a little thick, but it fooled his mom, and she nodded approvingly as he headed to the arcade to fetch his sister. He found her by the whack-a-mole tables. "Oh, Hazel, a word," he said, pulling her by the elbow with a sappy smile while her friends distracted themselves. He found himself standing once again in the aisle between the Fazbear stage and the arcade. Only this time, there was no creepy bear to step blankly off in the distance. The platform and bear had been removed, leaving only an impression on the carpet in front of the pillar. "What gives?" Alex said, once they were out of earshot. "What do you mean?" she actually had the nerve to say, squirming out of his grip while she looked back to wave to her friends. "I mean you're back to being perfect little Hazel, and Mom and Dad are catching on," he said, hoping she'd take the bait. "What are you talking about? Mom and Dad are thrilled. Everything is back to normal." She seemed mad at him for some reason, and he wondered for a second if she'd figured his plan out to expose her as a phony. Which is maybe why he played his hand a little too aggressively. "You know the party's almost over. You're going to go home without your stupid toy if you don't get in that wind tunnel." She shrugged, looking down. Her freckles practically disappeared under her flushed cheeks. "Maybe I don't need the toy anymore," she said. "Of course you do," he said, unleashing the full magnitude of his anger. She was clearly doing everything she could to push him to his limit. "You're not gonna get everything you want forever. Soon you're going to get older, and you won't be so precious, and then who's going to like you?" In all of her 10 years outside of the infant months, Alec had never seen his sister cry. Maybe she had thrown a fit or two when she was a toddler, but she'd always found better places to be when that sort of drama went down. But in that moment, for reasons he couldn't begin to understand, he watched as her light green eyes rippled with tears. And though she wouldn't let them spill to her cheeks, he could tell it was a monumental effort on her part to keep them in. "Fine," she said, and not a word more. She shoved past him and walked straight through her crowd of friends in the arcade toward the party room, greeting her mom and dad and aunt with an area smile before demanding to be let into the wind tunnel. "Oh yes, okay," the mom said, not the enthusiasm she'd been counting on, but she was quick to take action. "She's ready for the wind tunnel," she called out to the Freddy's staff like they were her ladies-in-waiting. 2 employees prepped the chamber by emptying the buckets of game tickets and coupons and sticky cellophane confetti into the top of the tube before flipping a switch to activate a strobe light that couldn't be looked at for too long without causing a touch of nausea. Another flip of the switch, and the wind in the tunnel was activated, sending the assortment of paper and milia whirling through the tube, mixing up the prize coupons in a dizzying frenzy. They switched the machine off again, then rather unceremoniously grabbed Hazel by the wrists and pulled her through the little entrance door to the tube. The strobe lights reactivated, and, as moths to a flickering flame, her friends migrated from the arcade back into the party room to witness the birthday girl's tornado of potential prizes. "Are you ready?" asked an employee. Hazel simply nodded, and Alec watched with measured awe as the storm kicked up around her, whipping her golden curls in front of her face and momentarily obscuring her behind the chaos. "Grab the tickets!" her friends screamed from behind Alec. Oh, the Young Foxy coupon! It's right there, baby, it's right there!" His mum hollered, jumping up and down as though that could help. But Alec knew better. He touched the side of his jeans pocket, where the single crinkle Yog Foxy coupon resided. Hazel barely reacted to the screams, though. She held her hands out haphazardly, making minimal attempts to grasp at any of the frenzied papers that flitted in and out of her fingers. "Is she okay?" that dad asked, squinting into the chaos of the tube. "You don't think she's gonna puke, do you?" "Oh boy, that would be a mess," Aunt Gigi said, and Alec had to stifle a snort. "Come on, Hazel!" he shouted above the crowd, pretending to cheer along with them. "Get that certificate! Get that fox!" But it was no use. Either she couldn't hear, or she simply didn't care. When the wind tunnel timer buzzed, Freddy Fazbear Associates dutifully pulled the plug, and this storm inside the enclosure came to an abrupt end. "Okay, boys and girls," the employee shouted into a microphone. "Let's see what the birthday girl has won." Kids from the party pushed and shoved toward the cylinder, with Hazel inside it, and she sidestepped their greedy hands as they snatched at the free tickets like they were actual dollar bills. "Well, Hannah, what have we got?" said the employee. "It's Hazel," Aunt Gigi corrected. "Okay," said the employee, ignoring Aunt Gigi and stepping dramatically over to Hazel as she cast him a wary look. "Let's see here." She handed him all the papers she had reluctantly grasped against her body, allowing him to sift through the various coupons and announce each one like she'd won the lottery. "1 free fountain drink. A bonus round at the Sky Dunk. 1. No. Make that 2 promotional Freddy Fazbear character cups." As the employee came to the end of the stack Hazel had captured, their mother started to shift nervously. She didn't get the fox. Alec heard her fret to their dad. Meg, relax. She doesn't even want it anymore. Yes, she does, Ian. She's just trying to be a big girl. Well, Hannah, that's quite a haul, the employee said once he'd read off all the prizes. Hazel! Aunt Gigi yelled, and this time the announcer looked over his shoulder long enough to cast her a sidelong glance. Hazel, he corrected, grimacing at Aunt Gigi, who smiled her fakest smile back. Wait! Screamed the girl named Charlotte, who couldn't eat chocolate. Look at her hair! Sure enough, as her friend spun her to the side, Hazel's curls cradled a small glittery ticket that looked different than any of the others she'd managed to capture in the tunnel. But Alec recognized it immediately. It's the young Foxy! It's the young Foxy! Screamed Charlotte. It's not possible, Alec thought. Anger bubbled in the pit of his stomach and began to churn, ready to erupt at any second. He remembered the tube before the wind tunnel had turned on. There'd been little scraps in there from the last round, and in this small pile of glittery confetti and tickets, a single Yog Foxy coupon must have been hiding, waiting to be kicked up again by a renewed wind. Alec was certain she hadn't meant for it to, but Hazel's face completely transformed. It was only for a fraction of a second, but he was looking at her at just the right time, and in that split second, he saw her utter relief at having won the prize she was determined not to want when the day came to get it. And no one would get to see the epic tantrum of Golden Hazel, the girl who had everything but didn't get the fox. That's right, boys and girls! Hazel has won her very own Yog Foxy! The announcer cried, and the kids from the party practically went into convulsions. They followed the employee all the way to the prize counter and swarmed him as he lifted the boxed Yog Foxy from the highest shelf, bestowing it upon Hazel like she'd just been crowned the queen. What a relief! Their mom sighed, falling back into a chair. Alec looked at her like she'd just grown a second head. A relief? It's a joke, he said, and she scowled at Alec. How can you say that? You know how much she wanted that toy. Does she look like she wants the stupid toy? He groused, still furious that Hazel was doing all she could to hide the fact that she was the spoiled one. Alec watched as she unboxed the fox and held it in her hands, smiling at it like it was some sort of long-forgotten treasure. Let me see! Let me see! Her friends begged, but Hazel smiled shyly and shook her head. Honey, why don't you want to play with it? Their dad asked, and Hazel simply demurred. It wasn't until her friends had lost interest and migrated back toward the arcade that their mom finally pulled Hazel aside. Sweetie, what is it? Don't you want the fox anymore? She asked, and Alec had just had about all he could take. Of course not! She gets everything she wants, and she's still not satisfied. But, aw, isn't it sad that Hazel doesn't want the fox anymore? Alec bellowed. He mocked. He sneered. But no one was listening. I told you she was going to throw up, the dad said. I'll go check on her. But just as he was headed to the back room where Hazel had disappeared, she reappeared with the fox, still clutching it in her hands, like it was suddenly very important to her after all. Hazel, sweetie, are you feeling okay? Their mom asked, stroking Hazel's curls, and suddenly Hazel didn't look so glum or distracted or nauseous to hear that dad tell it. Instead, she leaned into her mom and whispered something that made their mom practically melt into a little puddle right there on the Freddy Fazbear's floor. Then their mom did something unexpected. Alec, come here, hon, she said, and Alec eyed them both suspiciously. To be fair, so did their dad and Aunt Gigi. Just come here, their mom said, rolling her eyes, but she was still smiling. Alec approached his mom and sister with caution. He had the distinct impression he was walking into a trap. "Go on, Hazel. Tell him what you told me," their mom said. Hazel looked mortified. Her face was practically buried in the plush fox. "Look at you, shy as ever. Okay, I'll just be right over here," their mom cooed, and Alec was about to climb out of his skin. "What the heck are you doing?" he whispered through gritted teeth. He was so close to beating his sister at her own game. No, his own game. This was his to win. "Nothing," she said. "I don't want to do this anymore." "Do what?" Alex said, growing nervous. He looked up at his parents, but it didn't appear they'd had anything. "I don't want to pretend to be bad anymore. I was just getting you to like me." Alec was speechless. "Huh?" "Here," she said, and shoved the Yog Foxy into his chest. "It's for you." "Aw, sweetie, look," their mom said, and their dad shushed her, but their parents and Aunt Gigi continued to stare. "You can't be serious," Alex said. "I only wanted it so I could give it to you," she said. "What the heck am I supposed to do with a stupid fox?" he asked. No, he demanded. This was all just too much. How had she so expertly bested him? "I wanted you to stop hating me so much. Just take it, okay?" she said, and shoved it into his chest. None of this was working out the way it was supposed to. She was supposed to miss out on the fox, throw the epic fit he just knew she'd been storing up inside all week. And when his parents and all her friends saw her for the spoiled brat she really was, life should have gone back to the way Alec had enjoyed it before, with him to act in relative obscurity, without the burden of Golden Hazel's constant goodness. But now she had the fox. And what was she doing? She was giving it to him. In an act of utter sainthood, she was giving her most prized possession to him. She'd won it for him, because she knew how much he'd always wanted one. She just checkmated. "No," he said, flinging the fox back at her. "No, I don't want it." "Alec! What sort of way is that to act toward your sister? She's giving you her gift on her birthday," the mom cried. "She's just a phony. Can't you people see that? She's the worst kind of spoiled bratty fake. How can you not see that?" Alec was ranting now. It was all he could do to keep his head from spinning on his neck, exorcist style. "You want me to take the fox?" he said, and he could only guess by the way his mother looked at him that he looked positively maniacal. "Okay, fine, I'll take the fox." He ripped the toy back from his sister's grasp hard enough to tear the arm, sending soft tufts of stuffing floating into the air. Their mother let out an involuntary shriek, and Aunt Gigi put her hand on his sister's shoulder. "Meg, get a grip. You're making it worse." The dad tried to make it better. "Alec, come on, sport. Don't do this today." "Oh, I see, because it's so predictable that Alec would ruin the party. It's so inevitable that Alec would spoil perfect little Hazel's good time," he said, snarling at his family, who could only look back at him in horror. All of them, that is, except for Hazel. Hazel simply stood there, arms limp at her sides, as she stared at him. And there they were, the tears. She hadn't let them fall earlier. She had saved it all up for that moment, when she had the perfect audience. That's when she let the floodgates open, and even still, she only let a few fall. "I can't take it anymore!" Alec raged, and carried by the wind of the truly possessed, he fled the scene of his worst crime yet. He'd brought the whole party crashing down around him, just as they'd all predicted he would. He'd done his very best to get the better of his sister, and in the end, she'd still won. And if that wasn't enough, she'd actually made him believe, for the briefest moment, that she really was as good as she pretended to be, and that she'd wanted to be his friend. Pounding a path through the pizzeria, Alec whizzed past confused-looking staff and his sister's gang of friends, and one or two lonely Freddy bears, barely registering any of it, including Hazel's friend, Charlotte, who was about to puke because someone had ignored all warnings to the contrary and fed her chocolate. He didn't stop running until he pushed himself through at least 3 sets of doors and left the cacophony of kids and games and bells and singing behind him. He was somewhere in the cramped maze of back rooms that made up the inner workings of Freddy Fazbear's Family Pizzeria. He slowed to a walk as he tried to catch his breath, but it wasn't until he came to a complete standstill that he realized why it was he couldn't seem to exhale. It was because he kept gulping air in. It was because he was sobbing, just like a little kid, just like a spoiled brat. He backed against a wall and threw his shoulders against it, once and then again, tucking his chin to his chest as he let his shoulders absorb all the shock. "It's not my fault," he said, again and again. "It's not my fault." But the more he heard his pathetic words in his ears, the more he knew they weren't true. It was his fault, all of it. He'd ruined the party, ruined Hazel, ruined his whole 15 years by believing everyone was out to get him. He closed his eyes as he threw his shoulders again and again against the wall, as he pictured Hazel's watery eyes, the lines creasing his mom's forehead, his dad's head shaking in disappointment. Finally, he tired himself out enough to stop slumming against the wall, only to realize it wasn't a wall at all. It was a door. And what he'd thought was the sound of his own tantrum was actually a sound coming from the other side of the door, something that sounded like a loud thumping. Pressing his head against the door for a closer listen, he looked up and down the hallway to make sure no one was coming before he ducked into the room with the strange sound. The light switch was deep inside the room to his right, and he had to walk several steps in the dark, groping the wall until he finally found it, the door having closed with a heavy thunk just after he'd stepped inside. When the room was finally lit, he saw it was something of a storage room, only far more cluttered with what appeared to be abandoned toys, arcade games, and machinery than the extra stocks of napkins and paper cups he was expecting. The back wall was lined with long dormant arcade games Alec could remember being popular 10 or so years ago. Folded cafeteria-style tables were stacked in rows against the side table, their attached circular seats giving the arrangement a look like dominoes. The wall closest to him consisted of rows of wire racks, each holding various broken or dated toys that might once have been part of the prize counter display. Now, the cluttered shelves of sad, ownerless toys looked less like prizes and more like the stuff that goes missing under kids' beds. He slumped into one of the seats of a cafeteria table that had fallen from its place against the wall. His nose was still running from his meltdown in the hallway, and when he lifted his hand to drag it across his face, he felt a tickle of plush and remembered he was still holding the fox. Its torn arm dangled by a few stubborn threads. Otherwise, the toy was shiny new, just as it had been promised to the kid lucky enough to get that stupid coupon. "You weren't even supposed to be here," he said to the fox, but he couldn't muster the rage to give the words any bite. He was all angered out. In fact, he could hardly feel anything but the shame of having failed so miserably to show his sister up. Her words rang in his ears. "I wanted you to stop hating me so much." This couldn't be it. This couldn't be what his sister had wanted this whole time. To win a toy he'd never gotten because good kids earned 10,000 ticket prizes and bad kids got followed around by a bear for a friend. Alec held his head in his hands, hoping his mind would still, but memories of his sister came rushing back, crashing through his skull and ping-ponging off the insides of his brain like a dated arcade game. The pictures she would draw for him and randomly slip under the crack of the bathroom door. The dumb jokes he'd make that only she would laugh at. The last piece of pumpkin pie she would never eat at Thanksgiving because she knew it was his favorite. They were all the moments over the past week, times when he thought she'd be one-upping him, trying to outdo his cunning, times when he thought he caught her looking at him, but couldn't figure out what she was thinking. He just assumed she was scheming. But what if she was just looking? What if she was just waiting for him to be a big brother? Alec could barely form a cogent thought. It seemed impossible that he'd gotten it all so wrong. The attention his parents lavished on her and spared for him, the bad seed label he'd given himself that he was so certain the family had given him, the days and months and years he'd spent lamenting his outsiderness. What if they'd all actually wanted him inside with the rest of them? He thought about what Hazel told him the other day, how she'd seemed so upset, and she couldn't figure out why. "I bet you didn't even know that we moved here for you," she was trying to tell him, to get him to understand. "I wanted you to stop hating me so much." Alec couldn't control himself. He clutched the pirate fox, squeezing the life it didn't have out of it before throwing it as hard as he could into the shelves beside him, knocking a bin of outdated, unwanted toys to the floor right along with the brand new Yog Foxy with the torn arm. All the toys fell in a collective heap to the floor, spilling across the dusty ground in various thumps and squeaks. "Great," Alex said. "Just fantastic." It wasn't enough he'd ruined the party and hurt Hazel, but now he was going to get in trouble for trashing the back room of Freddy Fazbear's. He ducked behind the shelving rack and began sifting through the toys, throwing them back into the bin they fell out of while doing his best to locate the fox. After everything he'd already done, losing the toy she gave to him just wasn't an option, not if he ever had any hope of making things right. But finding the Yog Foxy proved to be a harder task than he'd thought it would be. There were rubber ducks and plastic snakes and felt puppets, but there was no peg-legged fox with a tragic torn arm. "Come on, seriously," Alex said, exasperated and utterly exhausted by this time. All he wanted was for this horrible day to be over with. Alec was so lost in the sea of toys that he forgot about the thumping, that strange sound he'd heard on the other side of the door before pushing his way in. He hadn't heard it again since opening the door, but the thumping was back now, echoing from some part of the room he couldn't see. Now that he was behind the shelving unit, though, he could tell that the sound was coming from somewhere close by. He peered into the far corner of the room, in a cluttered area behind the very last shelving unit lining the wall. There, tucked into a shadowy corner, was a large, green, dumpster-type container, a padlock sealing the lid shut. Alec took a few slow steps toward the dumpster, hoping beyond hope that the thumping wasn't coming from inside that bin. Now, beside the bin, he hadn't heard any more thumping for the last several seconds, and he was mostly satisfied that he'd been mistaken. Clearly, the thumping had to be coming from the other side of the wall the dumpster leaned against. But just as Alec slid his fingers underneath the lid to peek through the crack allowed by the lock, the bin rattled and thumped, and he stumbled backward, scooting as far away from the container as he could get. His heart pounded hard enough in his chest that he thought it might explode. But when nothing crawled out from under the crack in the lid, his pulse eventually began to slow to a normal pace. Rats. It had to be rats. Or some other sort of vermin. "Glad I didn't eat the pizza," he said to himself, and felt his stomach turn. Leaning on his elbow, Alec found himself wedged between the wall and the farthest shelving unit from the door, buried behind a sea of forgotten things. And there, staring at him from underneath a colorful canopy like something he might have seen in a circus, was a lonely Freddy bear, just like the one he'd seen staring into nowhere that day he argued with Hazel. "You again," he said to it. "You being punished or something?" But he immediately disliked the thought of the already unsettling bear having misbehaved. He stared at the bear as it stood at attention on its platform under the canopy, seeming to gaze at something just over Alec's shoulder. Alec turned and looked at the green dumpster behind him, but when he turned back around, he was startled to find that the lonely Freddy's eyes had somehow shifted. They seemed to be looking right at Alec. "I've been waiting for you, friend," the bear said. Alec stopped and stared at the bear. That's great," he said to it, and that should have been the end of it. Alec didn't expect it to say something else. "We should be best friends." "What?" Alec said, looking a little harder at the bear. Was this how it was supposed to work? He thought it was supposed to be sort of interviewing him, but the bear wasn't asking him questions so much as it was telling him things. "Very best friends," said the bear. "Okay," Alex said, trying to brush off the chill that kept running up his arm. "It's a stuffed animal," he said to himself. "It's a stupid toy." But it was strange that no matter how many times he tried, Alec couldn't seem to stand up. He couldn't seem to look away from the bear. All he could do was sit there and stare at it as it stared back. Alec had never noticed the bear's eyes before. Had they always been that blue? And if he didn't know better, he'd think that they were almost glowing. But that was crazy. Then it did start to ask him questions. "What's your favorite color?" "My favorite color?" Alec asked, almost if he wasn't in control of his own voice anymore. "My favorite color is green." The bear moved immediately to the next question. Wasn't it supposed to share things about it too? "What's your favorite food?" "Lasagna," said Alec, his answer automatic and immediate. "What do you want to be when you grow up?" "A pro skateboarder." "What's your best subject in school?" "History." It went on like that, for what felt to Alec like hours, but it couldn't possibly have been that long. He was having such a hard time feeling the floor underneath him or the sensation in his fingers. It was like he was floating, like he was hearing every question drift to him from the end of a long tunnel. Then, the bear's questions took a different turn. "Who do you admire most?" "My Aunt Gigi." "What do you fear the most?" "The dark." "What would you do if you were asked to hurt someone you love?" It felt like the bear was reaching its soft, plush paw into his very soul and extracting the answers he kept the most hidden. And it was doing so effortlessly. Its eyes were as blue and deep as an ocean trench. "What's your biggest regret?" And at this question, Alec did stop. He resisted at first, or maybe he simply didn't know the answer. But the bear wouldn't move on. It asked again. "What's your biggest regret?" Still, Alec hesitated, and the pull from inside of him began to grow painful, like something was squeezing him from his very core. "What is your biggest regret, Alec?" With the pressure building from inside, he could barely breathe against the pain, and through the tiny spaces in his gritted teeth, the answer trickled out. "Hurting Hazel." The pressure eased, and sensation eventually returned to Alec's body, warming his extremities all the way to the middle of him. But when his body breathed back to life, something felt fundamentally different. He stared hard into the blue eyes that had burned through his soul, and he searched for answers of his own, but he only came away with more questions because the blue eyes of the bear had suddenly turned light green. "What's happening?" he tried to ask the bear, because suddenly the bear seemed to be the one with all the answers, but Alec couldn't open his mouth. He stared, and the bear simply stared back. A panicky feeling began to rise in his chest. "I just need to get outside," he thought. "I need some air." But breathing wasn't his problem. Moving was. He tried to extend his leg to stand, but nothing happened. He wanted to push his palm to the floor to brace himself, but he couldn't. Voices, faint at first, but growing louder as they approached, gave him a touch of renewed hope. He recognized them immediately. "Mom! Hazel!" he called out, or at least he tried. But every time he felt his throat flex to yell, the words struggled to find their way out. "Don't worry, sweetie, we'll find it," he could hear his mom say. The thumping from the giant bin behind him kicked up again, and he wanted so badly to move away from it, but nothing was working. Every muscle suddenly felt crystallized. "Did you hear that?" Alec had Hazel say from the other side of the door. "Yes!" screamed Alec. "In here! Look in here!" He could hear the door open from the other side of the room, but he couldn't see around the shelving unit. All he could see was the bear, as its newly green eyes bored through him. "I don't think we're supposed to be in here," Alec's mom said, and he thought he'd never been more relieved to hear her voice. "Mom, look!" said Hazel. For a second, Alec's heart leapt. They'd spotted him. He couldn't see them, but maybe they saw him. "What if I'm having some sort of seizure?" he thought. No matter though, his mom and his sister were here to help now. Except why weren't they talking to him? Why hadn't they come around the side of the shelving unit? "Aw, see," his mom said. "I told you we'd find it." "But you haven't found me!" Alec tried desperately to scream. "I'm right here! I'm right here!" The thumping from the bin had gone silent the moment the door opened. And why now? Why couldn't the noise pick up again now? "He just threw it in here," Hazel said, and the pain in her voice was enough to make Alec feel like the smallest, most disgusting cockroach. "Hazel," their mom said, her voice so gentle, "he loves you. I know he does. In his own way, he really does love you, just like we love him." Alec's throat tightened into a knot, and this was the moment. This was finally the moment he would tell them how sorry he was, how wrong he was, how much he'd missed out on by wanting so badly to believe he was on the outside. Now all he felt was that he was somehow trapped inside. "Come on, sweets, the party is going to wrap up soon. Let's go polish off that cake, shall we?" "Hang on," Hazel said. "Please see me," Alec silently pleaded. "See me." "Oh, don't worry about the armor, hon. I can fix that when we get home," said their mom. Then he heard the worst sound. He heard Hazel choke on a sob. "Oh, honey," their mom said. "He hates me," said Hazel. "He doesn't hate you. He's never hated you." That was the thing, though. Alec had hated her. It was the worst, most awful confession he never made, but he didn't have to, because his sister had known all along. What she didn't know, what he hadn't told her when he should have, was that he didn't hate her anymore. If he was telling his own deepest, darkest secret, he'd have told her that he hated himself far more than he ever hated her, and he'd liked himself more this past week than he had since the day she was born, and it was because he'd spent it plotting with her. "Come on," their mom said, and he could practically hear her squeezing Hazel's shoulder. "This will blow over. These things always do. Let's not let it ruin your birthday." "No! No!" Alec tried to scream. Don't leave me! I can't move! But it was no use. No matter how loud the voice was in his head, he couldn't push the sound from his throat. Panic was rising at the base of his skull, and he was beginning to wonder what would happen if nobody came back here to look for him. Would they simply go home without him? Would anyone even miss him? Alex stared hard into the now green eyes of the bear, and mustered every ounce of strength he could find in his core. It seemed to take everything he had, but suddenly the bear before him was gone, hiding on the other side of Alex's closed eyes. He'd figured out how to close his eyes. Good, now breathe. Just count to 10 and keep breathing, he told himself. He pulled a deep breath in through his nose, out through his mouth, and repeated the exercise 10 times, and just as he reached the 10th exhale, he felt the tips of his fingers twitch. He was so excited. He opened his eyes, and he was stunned to find himself very much alone behind the shelving unit. The bear was gone, its custom platform empty. Where? But he didn't have time to think about that now. He had just regained the tiniest bit of movement in his fingertips, and he wasn't about to stop there. He closed his eyes once again and repeated the breathing, hoping it would do the trick again. Sure enough, as he reached 10, he found with great relief that he was able to wiggle his big toe. He repeated the exercise over and over, reteaching his body how to move, and pretty soon he could bend his knees and his elbows and even turn his head. The thumping in the bin behind him started up again, and he was suddenly furious that the sound returned now when it was too late to do him any good. Oh, shut up! Unfortunately, even though his limbs had begun to cooperate, his voice still hadn't returned, nor had his ability to even open his mouth. No time to worry about that now, he thought. He was starting to feel his motor function come back online, perhaps a bit clumsily, but as long as he could eventually get himself to stand, that's all that really mattered. Surely, once his parents and Aunt Gigi saw him, they'd see he was in need of help. He simply had to get out of this back room. It seemed like he had to squeeze every muscle in his body in order to get his feet under him. He continued to close his eyes and breathe, taking encouragement from the small victories. Leg bent, leg tucked, body balanced, other leg bent. And though it took forever, at long last, he managed to stand straight on 2 legs. The strangest thing, though, was that it almost seemed like he was still sitting. The shelf seemed so much higher than it had initially. In fact, the entire room looked bigger somehow, like the ceiling had risen. He moved stiffly at first, his legs jerking more than walking, and he had to work extraordinarily hard to get control of them. But after several steps, and as many pauses, Alec managed to find a rhythm adequate enough to move him to the other side of the room. But when he came upon the door, he was stunned to find that he couldn't reach the handle. It was at least a foot above his head. What? Using the same practice he'd employed to get his legs working, he closed his eyes and took several deep breaths, and eventually he was able to raise his hands high enough over his head to wiggle the handle of the door. He pushed through the door after managing to nudge the handle enough to open it, and when he stumbled into the hallway, Alec again had to do a double take to make sure he was in the right place to find his way back out to the restaurant. The hallway was much longer than it had been before. It seemed almost endless, and he felt so small inside of it. But Alec pushed on. He only had to get back to the party room. He only had to make his way back to his family. They would know what was wrong. They would know how to help him. The end of the hallway was blocked by yet another door he'd remembered being much less of an obstacle. The handle was even higher here than it had been in the storage room, and no matter how high he stretched his arms into the air, he couldn't reach the lever that would let him back into the restaurant. "Don't panic," he told himself. "Someone is bound to come back here at some point." He had to wait a lot longer than he thought he would. Slumped against the wall, to the side of the door, Alec tried not to let his mind wander too far. He was afraid he'd slip back into the trance he'd somehow fallen into in the storage room. The way the bear had gotten into his head, there was nothing natural about it. He wasn't sure what or how, but something had happened to him. Something horrible. He just hoped it wasn't irreversible. He hoped a lot of what happened today could be reversed. All of a sudden, the door swung wide, nearly crushing Alec behind it, and he had to throw himself through the opening before the door slammed shut again. Nose on the floor of the Freddy Fazbear carpet, he was again surrounded by the piercing screams and jangling game bells of the arcade. The second Alec landed on the floor, he felt the wind knocked squarely out of him. "Goal!" He heard someone call, and then he heard others laugh. But that was all, as he soared through the air, still trying to find his breath. He landed with a painful thud, this time face up and staring at the etched glass lampshades that covered each of the tables in the pizzeria. Feet pounded all around him, dangerously close to his head, and he winced as sneaker after sneaker narrowly missed squashing some part of him. Why is everyone acting like they don't see me? No sooner had the thought occurred to him than he was grabbed roughly by the arm and clutched tightly into an itchy wool vest. "I saw it first!" said a voice, and suddenly someone was tugging hard on his leg. "No, I call dibs!" said the kid holding him. And how big were these kids that they were able to play tug-of-war with him? "No, me! Me!" His leg was being pulled so hard, he was terrified it might come off any second. He wanted to go back to not being seen. Then, just as quickly as the tug-of-war had started, a voice in the distance yelled, "Pizza's here!" And he was again dropped onto the carpet. He lay there on his side, trying to recover himself, but a stroller wheel wobbled straight for his head, and he squeezed his eyes shut as he awaited certain death. "Jacob, move that thing out of the way, would you?" said the person behind the stroller, and someone nudged Alec with their foot, wedging him against the baseboard. "Move that thing?" Alec thought, and if he weren't so out of his mind confused and in a fair amount of pain, he might have been offended. He managed to brace himself against the wall and get to his feet, but he was so wobbly he wasn't sure he'd be able to make it across the room without falling over. Still, he was determined. He had to make it back to the party room. He just had to make it back to his family. Surely they'd be looking for him by now, wouldn't they? Alec wobbled and weaved across the eatery, dodging stomping feet and spilled colas, getting sprinkled with parmesan and crushed peppers from table-side shakers. After several near-death experiences, Alec found his way to the other side of the cavernous room amid the throngs of kids and families. As he rounded the corner, he spied the enormous cylindrical tube that made up the wind tunnel, now dormant and awaiting the next birthday kid once Hazel's party was over. Then there was his family, his mom in her dark jeans, and his dad in his comfiest corduroy slacks and his flannel shirt, Aunt Gigi with her hair pulled back in her headband, and there was Hazel, her blonde ringlets hanging in front of her face, but still not obscuring the smile that couldn't help but light up the room. Her friends were leaning back in their chairs, rubbing their full bellies and rifling through goodie bags as they waited for their parents to pick them up. They all looked so happy. Hazel especially beamed. It was like someone had switched the light on inside of her again. She was all at once relieved of the burden Alec had placed on her being himself. Except not the self he wanted to be. Not anymore. He wanted to be the reason she would smile like that more often. He was ready. That's when Alec saw that, in fact, he was the reason she was beaming. There, sitting across the table from his sister and their parents, was Alec. It was the same rumpled t-shirt he'd thrown on that morning before the party. The same ripped jeans. The same unruly golden curls that provided the counterbalance to Hazel's perfect ringlets. It was his light green eyes, his slightly crooked teeth, his lanky limbs. And he was smiling. Smiling right back at Hazel. "Hey," Alex said, the voice in his head quiet at first, but quickly it was screaming. "Hey! That's not me! That's not me!" But anyone looking at the kid across from Hazel would beg to differ. In every way, this person was most certainly him. Those questioning it might point to the fact that he wasn't sulking like the Alec they know. He wasn't glowering at his sister the way he was known to do more often than not. But he had seemed to be making an effort all week to turn over a new leaf, hadn't he? His parents had been trying this new technique, a method endorsed by a reputable doctor and best-selling author. Some kids just took longer to come into their own. Wasn't it nice that Alec had managed to do just that, and on his sister's birthday of all days? How sweet! How perfect! What a family they were turning out to be. Alec forced his stiff legs forward and tumbled into the party room, but he could barely see above the table when he got inside. He thought maybe he could try climbing one of the table legs, but it was too slick. He moved from kid to kid, crowding around the table, doing whatever he could to attract the attention of just one of them. He had to get on top of that table. He had to look into his mom's eyes. She'd have to recognize him then, wouldn't she? Of course she would. "Look down! Someone please just look down!" His mind screamed, but just as before, his throat refused to release his pleas. "It's a bad dream. This has to be some crazy elaborate nightmare." But it didn't feel like a nightmare. In fact, nothing had ever felt more real in his entire 15 years. He spied the girl called Charlotte sitting curled up in a chair in the corner, clutching her stomach. She was the only kid not talking to someone else. She was his best chance at attracting attention. But as he waved his arms to try and flag her interest, she turned suddenly and spewed all over his head, warm vomit dripping into his eyes and running down his face. Oh no, Charlotte, honey, is your stomach still bothering you?" Alec could barely see through the puke pouring in rivers over his eyes, but the sound of his mom's voice was such a relief. In a minute, this whole insane day would come to an end, and he'd be able to rejoin his family. "Oh, gross!" someone shouted, and to his horror, it was his own sister. "She puked on one of the bears!" "Wait, what?" "Hold on, I'll get one of the staff to come and clean it up," their dad said. "Here, let me help," Aunt Gigi said, and he watched from his periphery as beautiful, wonderful Aunt Gigi hurried to his corner of the room. "Thank you," he whimpered in his head. His Aunt Gigi would know what to do. But instead of coming to Alec's aid, Aunt Gigi gently pulled Charlotte from her chair and sat her on the bench closer to Hazel and the fake Alec, who passed napkins to her so she could clean herself up. "Have some water," Hazel said, offering her a cup. "Here, you got some on your hair," the fake Alec said. Then he turned to Alec, his eyes, His stolen green eyes and his stolen body gleamed at Alec as he stood in the corner, dripping in vomit, watching his family welcome him into their fold. And then the fake Alec smiled. "Yes, just over here. Sorry, I think we ruined one of your bears," Alec heard his dad say from outside of the room. And just then, a Freddy's employee arrived with a mop and bucket. "No problem, sir. We'll take care of this mess. You just go back to enjoying your party." And with that, Alec was tossed into a bucket and rolled away, his vision still obscured, but not too much that he didn't see the fake Alec wink at him from the table before returning his attention to a smiling, laughing Hazel with a smiling, happy family. In the bucket, Alec was quickly rolled to the back of the pizzeria once again. The doors he'd worked so hard to move thrust open and shut with ease by the employee. He made a quick stop in the men's room, where he shoved the wheeled bucket and mop into the corner and wrung out the rag in the maintenance sink before slopping it over the side of the bucket, flecking the mirror beside them with large droplets of water. Alec turned slowly to the mirror. He only then realized he was parked beside. There, in the reflection, stared a blue-eyed, 2-foot Freddy Fazbear, its hair matted and starting to crust over with puke, its arms extended and ready for a hug. This can't be. This can't possibly be. But Alec had no time to contemplate what it was and what it wasn't. Before he knew it, they were on the move again. The employee pinched Alec's paw between 2 fingers. "Yick," he said, scrunching up his nose before holding Alec as far in front of him as he could. "Into the bin for you," he said. He kicked open the men's room door and traveled quickly down the hall to the storage room Alec had escaped to earlier. "Wait," he tried to say. "Wait!" But as ever, it was no use. The employee pulled the collection of keys from a retractable cord on his belt loop as he made his way to the very back of the storage room toward a familiar, large green dumpster. "Which one is it?" he muttered to himself before landing on the right one. "Aha! Here it is." Then the employee stuck the key in the padlock over the bin's lid, and with a sharp turn to the left, the padlock sprang open. "Have fun with your little buddies," he said, and released his pinch on Alec's paw, sending him falling through the air and into the bin. The light from the room illuminated his surroundings in the bin long enough for Alec to see why it hadn't hurt when he fell in. His fall had been broken by dozens of plush bears that looked exactly like him. Dozens of discarded lonely Freddys. "Nighty-night," the employee said, and just like that, the light above him extinguished with the closing and locking of the lid. Panic seeped into Alec's pores, or what might have once been pores. In his head, he screamed and he screamed, but in the end, the only sound that crept from his unhinged, stuffed bear mouth was the tiniest squeak. "Help!" he thought he heard himself say. Then he realized it hadn't been him at all. It had been the bear beside him in the bin. Then it was the bear on the other side of him. Pretty soon, it was every bear in the bin, their thin, muted screams for help swallowed by the metal and darkness that entombed them. Alec and his new friends, dozens of the lonely ones. And that is the end of Story 2. Thank you for listening to this read-through of Five Nights at Freddy's Fazbear Frights Number 2, Story 2, Lonely Freddy. If you enjoyed listening to it, please hit that like button. I really do appreciate it. And if you are new to this channel, subscribe for Story 3 of this novel. And If you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to my second channel where I do reaction videos. Also, make sure you click that bell so you'll be notified whenever I upload a new video. And I'll be back next time with the next story. Alright? See ya. Five Nights at Freddy's. Fazbear Frights. Number 2. Story 3. Out of stock. It was just like Oscar to be on the losing end of the deal. It had always been that way from the time his dad went to the hospital for a tonsillectomy and contracted a fatal infection, to the time that they had to move to the cheaper end of town, to all the times Oscar had to help his mom at the Royal Oaks nursing home while the rest of his friends spent their allowances at the mall. So it was no surprise to Oscar when he learned that the plush trap chaser, a light-activated chomping green rabbit, and by far Oscar's favorite character from the Freddy Fazbear world, would go on sale on the most ridiculous day, at the most ridiculous time imaginable. Friday morning. Friday morning! Oscar steamed. Man, you've got to get over it, said Raj, kicking the same stone down the sidewalk he'd been torturing the entire way to school. But the injustice of it, Oscar said. It's a kid's toy. Why would it go on sale when every kid in the known universe is in school? Oscar swatted at a low-hanging tree branch like it wronged him. Did you hear Dwight already got one? Isaac asked, bringing up the rear. What? Raj stopped for a minute, now adequately outraged. He hadn't even heard of Freddy Fazbear before last year. Apparently his dad made a call. His dad's always making a call, pouted Isaac. Dwight's a jerk, said Raj, and on this, the boys all agreed. It was so much easier to hate Dwight than to admit that they weren't the types who had dads who could make calls to get ugly green rabbits that stood the height of a toddler and maintained the speed of an actual rabbit. We'll never get it, not if we have to wait until 4 o'clock, Isaac said. We could, Oscar started, but Raj cut him off. No, we can't, he said. How did you... We can't ditch. It's not possible. I have 2 strikes already. 1 more, and my mom's going to send me to boot camp. Come on, she wasn't serious about that, Oscar said. You don't know my mom, said Raj. One time, my sister talked back to her, and my mom wouldn't let her talk for a week. That didn't actually happen. Isaac chuckled. Oh no? Ask Avni. She says by the 6th day, it's like she forgot how to talk at all. Raj looked in the distance, haunted by the spectre of his mother, while Oscar turned to Isaac. Don't look at me. I have to walk Jordan home. Oscar knew he couldn't argue with that one. Even as little brothers go, Jordan was okay, and Oscar knew for a fact that Isaac's mom would go nuclear if he even thought about leaving Jordan alone until she got home from work at 3 o'clock. There was no getting around it. Despite all of Oscar's big ideas, he knew he was too afraid to actually go through with it. Ditching school was like a mortal sin to his mom, who'd fought hard for her own education while raising Oscar by herself. Oscar and his friends would have to wait until 4 o'clock. The day was agonizingly long. Mr. Tallis made the entire class recite the preamble of the Constitution over and over until they got it right. Mrs. Daphne popped a completely unfair quiz on isotopes. Coach Riggins made them run laps around the field, even though it was still muddy from the last rain. Oscar thought maybe he'd never faced a more miserable day. Then, at 2:33, it got worse. 2 minutes before the final bell rang, Oscar was called to the front office. Now? His geometry teacher shrugged, helpless to bail Oscar out, despite his being Oscar's favorite teacher. Sorry, Mr. Avila. Nobody ever said sophomore year was cruelty-free. He turned to Raj and Isaac, in the only class they'd ever shared since they met on the playground in the 3rd grade. Mustering all his strength, he tried not to choke on his sacrificial offering. Wait for me until 3:30. If I'm not back by then, the whole class sat in witness. Then go without me. Raj and Isaac nodded solemnly, and Oscar scooped up his notebooks and bag and cast one glance at Mr. Enriquez. It's your mom, he murmured, patting Oscar firmly on the shoulder. Mr. Enriquez knew Oscar's mom sometimes needed Oscar's help at the Royal Oaks nursing home. He didn't know exactly what his mom's job was, but it had something to do with making sure the whole place didn't come undone. His mom was important. The secretary at the front desk was waiting impatiently for Oscar, the receiver already in hand. Thought he got lost, she said humorlessly. Does your mom know this is why most parents get their kids cell phones? Oscar bared his teeth into something simulating a smile. I think she just likes hearing your voice on the regular, he said, and the secretary matched his smile. Besides, phones aren't allowed at school. Not that we can afford one, he thought, not without a little venom toward the secretary. Oscar took the phone from her hand fast, because she looked like she was about to smack him with it. LM, Mr. Devereaux isn't doing well today, Oscar's mom said. His mom only used his nickname, LM, code for Little Man, when her need was dire. Not this. Not today. Mr. Devereaux was possibly the world's oldest man, and when he was out of sorts, there were only a few people who could reason with him enough to get him to take his meds or eat something. For some inexplicable reason, Oscar was one of those people.
Where's Connie? Oscar whined, referencing the only orderly to whom Mr. Devereaux responded. Porta Velata, where I should be, his mom said. Besides, he's asking for you. Oscar handed the phone back to the secretary, who already had her purse in hand, as she tapped her white-tipped fingernail on the counter between them. I trust you've resolved your crisis. I have to get to the toy box before they sell out of plush traps. I have 5 nephews. It was almost too much for Oscar to bear. 5 fewer plush traps after Mrs. Beasley in his head, snagged whatever might be left for her undeserving nephews. Oscar dragged his feet in misery all the way to the number 12 city bus, transferred to the 56 line, and walked the quarter-mile from the bus stop to his mom's work, moping into the lobby of the Royal Oaks nursing home. Irvine, seated at the reception desk, nodded to him from under his headphones. Dude's in a bad way, big man, Irvine said loudly, his volume unchecked by the deep bass line emanating from his playlist. He says Marilyn wants to steal his soul. Oscar nodded. Irvine was well versed in the oddities of Royal Oaks, including Mr. Devereaux's chronic baseline paranoia. Hearing Irvine confirm what his mom had already told him on the phone did nothing to alter Oscar's position of unconditional surrender. He would be here all afternoon, likely into the evening, trying to calm Mr. Devereaux. The plush trap chaser, if he'd ever had a chance at getting it in the first place, would never be his now. The automatic doors whooshed open, revealing the back of his mama's tall figure. She handed a clipboard back to an orderly Oscar hadn't met before. This place went through orderlies, like Oscar went through electric blue fruit punch. Make sure Miss Delia doesn't get any diary after 4 p.m., his mom said. She'll fart so much we'll have to quarantine the room, and I promise you, I'll make sure you're the only one assigned to that wing for the entire night. The new orderly nodded earnestly, clearly shaken, and hurried away with the clipboard just as Oscar's mom turned to smile at him, arms extended. That was a thing about his mom. She could always be counted on for a hug strong enough to crack ribs. Even the time she threatened to put a bounty on Oscar's head after he rescued a bat and set it free in the house, she still managed to hug him hard enough to make him sore the next day. Mr. Devereaux thinks Marilyn wants to steal his soul, I heard, Oscar said. After 18 years, you'd think Marilyn had earned the benefit of the doubt. No rest for the truly suspicious, Oscar said, and his mom smiled at him. Thank you, little man. You are my angel. Mom, he said, looking around to make sure no one heard, even though the only ones who would give him a hard time were miles away at the toy box, claiming the very last plush trap, no doubt. The thought of Raj and Isaac lining them up for epic, chomping battles in the yard was pure energy. Oscar began to think about compromises. Maybe if he gave Raj or Isaac half the amount, one of them could be persuaded to let him take partial plush trap custody. Oscar managed a weak smile at his mom and wondered if the fates might bestow upon him a plush trap. If they witnessed his angelic behavior, he knew better than to hope, though. When he arrived in Mr. Devereaux's doorway, he found the old man staring into the corner of his room, his eyes trained like lasers, ready to vaporize. It started, Mr. Devereaux said, his voice barely above a whisper. What started? Oscar asked, not so much curious as eager to begin this process. She's been plotting this whole time. I should have known. She waited until I let my guard down. Come on, Mr. D. You don't really believe that. I can feel my soul slipping away. It's oozing out of my pores, Oscar. Mr. Devereaux didn't sound afraid. Rather, he seemed resigned to his fate, and Oscar thought maybe they had something in common today. But why would she do that? Oscar asked. She loves you. She's shared your room every night for almost 2 decades. Don't you think if she wanted your soul, she would have taken it by now? Trust cannot be rushed, young man, Mr. Devereaux said. Good fortune cannot be predicted. It was these seeds of wisdom that kept Oscar interested and Royal Oak's longest-term resident. No matter how many times Mr. Devereaux let some sage observation slip, Oscar was surprised every time, like Mr. Devereaux could sense what was occupying Oscar's mind. Even if Mr. Devereaux's own mind was like a sieve, his thoughts slipping through holes into some bottomless abyss. Maybe Marilyn isn't stealing your soul. Maybe she's guarding it. You know, like holding it for safekeeping. Oscar posited. Mr. Devereaux shook his head. I thought of that. It's a tempting theory, but she should have asked permission. These are the times when Oscar struggled, when logic had to win. I mean, it's not like she can actually ask you, he said. Of course she can, Mr. Devereaux raged, and Oscar put up his hands, trying to ease Mr. Devereaux before the new orderly came scurrying around the corner. Okay, but just stick with me for a minute, Mr. D, Oscar said, sneaking 2 steps into Mr. Devereaux's room. Maybe she thought, you know, since you were close enough, that she wouldn't mind if she, borrowed your soul for a bit. Mr. Devereaux cut his eyes toward Oscar, suspicious. She didn't tell you to say that, did she? No, of course not. No one could come close to the, relationship you have. Mr. Devereaux looked into the corner of the room that had held his attention until that moment. Well, Marilyn, what do you have to say for yourself? Oscar followed Mr. Devereaux's stare, and now they were both staring at the same ancient calico cat who had slept on the pillow by the window of Mr. Devereaux's room for as long as Mr. Devereaux had slept in his own bed. She didn't come here with Mr. Devereaux, at least according to legend. She'd been a neighborhood stray. But one day, the staff found her in the room, and without objection from the rotating cast of residents, Marilyn had remained, finding Mr. Devereaux's company the most pleasing, despite his periodic disdain, or downright hatred. No amount of scratching behind the ears, or catnip offerings by anyone else could entice her away from Mr. Devereaux. Maybe she really was after his soul. Marilyn blinked her slow cat blink at Mr. Devereaux. Well, I think we both know what that means, Oscar improvised, and for a second, Mr. Devereaux looked confused. But after another moment of contemplation over the loud purring of Marilyn, something inside him settled. All right then, it seems Marilyn owes you yet another debt of gratitude, young man. Marilyn stretched languidly on her chair and yawned, but Oscar wasn't looking for gratitude from a cat. He was looking for a way out. Sit down, young man, sit down, Mr. Devereaux said, and Oscar let the last of his hope slip away. This was to be his entire afternoon. Oscar slumped in the chair closest to the door. Mr. Devereaux stared at him with the watery eyes of an old man. My soul may be in trouble, he said, but your heart is stolen. Oscar tried to laugh. If he didn't, he might cry. It was just the latest and what he was panning out to be a lifetime of almost. He had almost made varsity baseball, but he dislocated his elbow. He had almost saved enough for a cell phone, but someone picked his pocket on the train. He had almost had a whole family, but then he lost his dad. If you could earn a trophy for almost, he'd probably fall shy just of the honor. Ah, yes, Miss Devereaux continued. Love is a many splendid thing, until it crushes you to pieces. It's not like that, Oscar said. It was ridiculous to set the record straight. Mr. Devereaux might or might not even remember this conversation, but he needed someone to know, needed someone to confide in, and truly, he had never known a better listener than this man whom he had never once seen standing, whose first name he didn't even know. It's just a stupid toy, Oscar said, but even as he tried to diminish the plush trap, he felt his heart squeeze. It broke, Mr. Devereaux said. It was never even mine, said Oscar, and Mr. Devereaux nodded slowly. Marilyn began a long practice of cleaning herself. And I take it the toy will never be yours, Mr. Devereaux said. Oscar felt ridiculous hearing it in those terms, hardly something that should be causing a 12-year-old to despair. It's not even that special, Oscar lied. Ah, but the toy's only the stem that breaks ground, Miss Devereaux said, and Oscar looked up from his feet to stare into the old man's eyes. He might have been slipping into one of his lapses, but Oscar was surprised to see Mr. Devereaux looking right at him. The reason for the wanting is what lies underneath. It's the soil that feeds the want. Mr. Devereaux leaned a little closer to Oscar, pressing his veiny arm against the guardrail, enough to make Oscar nervous. I think you have tilled quite a lot of soil in your handful of years on this earth, he said. So much wanting. But you've never been able to pluck the fruits of your labor from the ground, have you? Oscar was never any good at growing things. He killed every plant he tried to water, every fish he tried to nurture. I don't think you know, he started, but Mr. Devereaux didn't let him finish. The best cultivators are the ones who know when the time is right to pick the crop, he said. And Oscar was trying, he really was, but Mr. Devereaux was losing him fast. Mr. D, you're real nice to try. Ugh. Mr. Devereaux groaned like something hurt. He leaned away from his position against the rail and arched his back. Oscar could hear something pop deep inside the man's rickety bones. Marilyn paused her bath long enough to make sure Mr. Devereaux was okay. A grower, maybe, but a thinker you're not. Mr. Devereaux said to Oscar, sometimes you have to know when to go for it, even when it doesn't look possible. Oscar said to Mr. Devereaux, quit sitting here and go find your precious toy. Mr. Devereaux yelled, his phlegmy throat catching on the words, and he began to hack. Marilyn wound herself into a tight ball on her chair. The new orderly appeared out of nowhere, standing in the doorway, but reluctant to walk any closer. Is everything all right in here, Mr. Dev? No, everything is not all right, you daft ferret. Go and get me a glass of water, for the love of... The orderly scurried away, but Oscar couldn't seem to get up from his chair. He was frozen in place, contemplating the prophecy he'd received in a haze of cat hair and disinfectant. What? You don't think she looks like a ferret? No one should have a face that small, Mr. Devereaux said to Oscar. But what if it's sold out everywhere? Oscar said, his brain finally coming back online. Don't you young people have the internet? Or your computer phones? Or iWhatsits? Somebody has the stupid toy somewhere, Mr. Devereaux said, coughing up a little more phlegm. The point is, quit tilling. It's time to pick. The orderly returned with a small yellow cup, and Mr. Devereaux took it from her roughly, before turning on her side, his back to her and to Oscar. Marilyn poked an ear up, to be sure all was well before resettling into her coil. In the space of 5 seconds, Mr. Devereaux was snoring loudly, his ribs rising and falling inside his threadbare pajamas. Looks like you took him out, the orderly said to Oscar as they shuffled out the door, closing it behind them. You're my hero. Oscar felt dizzy by the time he made his way back to the front desk. His mom was hustling down the hall with 3 orderlies in tow, each following her like ducklings struggling to keep up. You're a good soul, his mom said to Oscar without looking up from her clipboard. Oscar knew she meant it, though. She was just busy. He calls the new orderly a ferret, Oscar said. His mum shrugged and mumbled something about a small face. Anyway, I told Raj and Isaac I'd meet up with them, Oscar said, slinging his backpack over his shoulder. Oh? Anything fun happening? She asked, still absorbed in her paperwork. One of the orderlies was trying to get her attention. Oscar stared at the top of his mom's head, the gray streak that ran from her colic to her crown, suddenly looking larger, like age had poured over her head while she slept one night. Nah, he said, nothing special. She cupped his chin gently in her palm, finally looking up, and Oscar smiled back because she was always trying her hardest. She always had. He turned on his heel toward the doors. Oh, Oscar, can you pick up some yolk? Sorry, Mom, gotta run, Oscar said as he fled the lobby and returned to the safety of the vestibule. He was almost out the door when Irvine, still bobbing his head to whatever played in his ears, yelled over the music. You got a message, he said. Huh? Said Oscar. What? Said Irvine, then pulled his headphones around his neck. You got a message.
From the short one. What's his name? Isaac? He called here for me? Oscar said, utterly confused. He couldn't remember a single time his friends had ever tried reaching him in here, even though it seemed like he spent just as much time at Royal Oaks as he did in his own home. If anything, sometimes Raj or Isaac would wait for Oscar to finish helping his mom, wasting time in the vestibule while Irvine ignored them. Said you got to meet them at the mall. Something about a trap? Irvine said. The mall? Not the toy box? Wait, when did they call? Oscar demanded, which got Irvine's attention. Well, let me just check the messaging service, he said, reaching for an imaginary memo pad. Sorry, it's just 10 minutes, maybe, Irvine said, softening. 10 minutes. If it took him 20 on the bus, another 10 to walk from the bus stop to the mall, there might still be time to get there before they close. I gotta go! Have fun. Nah, whatever, Irvine said, as he pulled his headphones back over his ears, the doors already swishing closed behind Oscar. Oscar danced around the bus stop like he had to pee, leaning off the sidewalk into the street to see if he could spot the marquee on every passing bus. Drivers honked him out of the way, but he barely noticed them. Finally, the number 56 bus arrived, slowing to an agonizingly long stop and sighing down to meet the curb. It was standing room only, and Oscar felt irrational fury toward anyone who dared to pull the stop cord. It seemed there wasn't a 2-block stretch where they didn't stop to let someone on or off, and Oscar was about to burst with impatience. When the mall stop finally came, he was so eager to get off, he nearly forgot to pull the cord for himself. Whoa, here! He yelled up to the driver, who grumbled something about not being his personal chauffeur. Oscar hollered a quick apology over his shoulder as he booked it through the thick grove of eucalyptus trees that were definitely someone's private property to get to the mall's east entrance, the closest one to the Emporium. The Emporium had nearly closed 3 different times, always on the verge of bankruptcy, always rescued at the last minute by some mystery financer who, according to Chipper New Anchors on the evening broadcast, couldn't bear to see another independent business succumb to one of the big chain toy stores. It might have been an act of charity if the Emporium hadn't been so gross. Oscar was pretty sure the place had never been mopped. Mystery splatters lined the baseboards all around the cavernous store, not a single stain ever moving from where it had made its home. Oscar himself had made one of those stains when he was 11, puking up an entire radiation-green big slurp right in front of the beach ball display. Though he tried not to look, every time he went into the Emporium, he saw the telltale green flecks that had never been thoroughly scrubbed from the back wall. The stores seemed to always be half-lit, the fluorescent lights high above buzzing and flickering like they resented being on. But maybe the most depressing part of the Emporium was its perpetually unstocked shelves. They'd carry maybe a handful of the really good toys everyone was clamoring for that year, but the rest of the cavernous store was occupied by half-emptied displays of dusty generic dolls, action figures, and play sets that the parents who were too late or too broke had to resort to. Oscar knew for a fact his mom had stopped into the Emporium more than a few times, always at the end of a nightly shift, looking for the closest facsimile to a brand-name toy her small paycheck could buy. Oscar never let her see his disappointment, but the Emporium was the only toy shop located in the mall. All the rest in town were the big standalone stores. If Isaac was telling him to meet them there, they must know something that everyone else in the entire town didn't. Only that didn't seem to be the case once Oscar opened the door to the east entrance. Even from far away, he could see a squirming line of people trying to squeeze into the Emporium. It was more foot traffic than the store probably saw in a year. Oscar slowed to a walk as he approached the crowd with caution, so unnerved by the sight of that many people pushing to get into the Emporium of all places. Sure enough, there at the register by the door, a single petrified teenager was failing spectacularly at urging people to be patient. Poor guy probably had zero idea of what he was walking into that day for his shift. Oscar! Oscar searched for Isaac in the crowd, but as Irvine had reminded him less than an hour before, Isaac was the short one. He was hard enough to find in a crowd half this size. Over here! That time it was Raj, and finally, after sweeping the jostling crowd 3 times, Oscar spotted his friends jumping above the surrounding heads. He wasn't all that far from the front of the line, which had to mean they somehow got the inside track on the inventory. Oscar squeezed his way past a gaggle of angry customers. Hey! There's a system here, kid! One guy growled, and Oscar had to hide his laugh because, really, this was a system? Oscar ducked a couple more grumbles before finally reaching Raj and Isaac, the latter on tiptoe, trying to see how far they were to the front. Dude, we tried the toy box, marbles, and that place on 23rd and San Juan, said Raj, skipping right to the point. We even went to that weird organic place on 5th Street that only sells wooden toys, said Isaac. If they ever had it at all, they sold out in like 5 minutes, said Raj. But the Emporium has them, Oscar asked, still in disbelief. He hadn't actually seen anyone leave with one, and seeing was believing. Not on the shelves, Raj said, getting to the good part. We saw Thad outside of Rockets, and he was holding this big Emporium bag, so we knew something had to be up. He didn't want to, but he showed us. Well, he showed us the top of the box, and he definitely had one. He was all smug about it, said Isaac. I guess his sister's dating the assistant manager here, and he said they got a small stock of them, but the manager wasn't putting them on the shelf. Probably wanted to sell them himself online, Raj said. Jack. Guess word got out, Oscar said, watching the crowd watch everyone else. No one wanted to be the first in line to hear, "We just sold the last one." The crowd surged suddenly, knocking the entire quasi-line forward, and a general rumble of protest burbled from the customers. Isaac fell against Oscar, who fell against the lady in front of him, who complained louder than the rest. "Excuse me," she said, only half turning to shoot Oscar a dirty look. The secretary, Miss Beasley, the one with 5 nephews. "Oh no," Oscar whispered. "She's gonna clean them out," he hissed to Raj and Isaac. "She can't. Limits 1 per customer," said Raj. "Don't worry, I've got a good feeling." "Oh well, if you have a feeling." Oscar rolled his eyes, but secretly he was grateful for Raj's optimism. It's not like Oscar had any of his own to offer. Mr. Devereux's pep talk about harvesting was a distant memory. After an entire eon had passed, the line crawled forward, and the secretary from the boys' school was next. "Do you mean limit 1 per person?" "Sorry, ma'am, that's the rule," said the clerk, looking like he was maybe seconds from a meltdown. "Whose rule?" "My manager's, ma'am," he said, and the line behind them sighed loudly. "Haven't you been listening, lady? He said it 100 times already," groaned one guy, unlucky enough to still be squeezed against the shelf closest to the door. "Well, what am I supposed to tell my nephews?" Miss Beasley asked, matching the guy's grumpiness. "How about you tell them, oh, I don't know, that the limit was 1 per person," the guy said, and Oscar had to admire his spunk. No one at school dared to talk to the secretary that way. "Ma'am," The clerk interrupted. "I can sell you one, but you'll have to move along." The secretary gave him a look that Oscar was pretty sure could melt human brains. "I mean, if it's okay," he said, but it was too late. He was already liquefying. Miss Beasley slammed her giant purse on the counter and taffed her way through counting out her cash, then exchanged it for one glorious plush-trap chaser. It was the first time Oscar had actually seen one in the flesh, or stuffing, or whatever. Even from behind the cellophane window of the box, the thing looked perfectly terrifying. Its plastic eyes bulged from even wider eye sockets, making the face look skeletal. The mouth hung open to reveal lines of unsettlingly pointed, canine-looking teeth. With the toy standing almost 3 feet tall, the clerk had to stand on tiptoe to get the box over the counter and into the secretary's grasping hands, and she shooed away the plastic bag he offered, decidedly done with this entire transaction. She walked away in a huff, dozens of eyes following her purchase out the door before returning their attention to the keeper of the treasure. The crowd surged forward, but it wasn't necessary. Oscar, Raj, and Isaac were practically crawling over the counter. "1 plush-trap chaser, please," Oscar said breathlessly. "If there's only one left, we can split it." The boys shoved their hands into their pockets to pool their money, a compromise they hadn't even needed to discuss. If 1 plush-trap was all they could get, then they'd just have to share it, all for one and all that. They understood how scarcity worked. "Sorry," the guy behind the counter said, but he didn't look sorry so much as terrified. "What do you mean, sorry?" Oscar said, but on some level he already knew. No. No. Isaac shook his head. "Don't say it." The clerk swallowed, his Adam's apple traveling up and down his neck. "We're sold out." The crowd erupted in protest, and whether it was conscious or not, the clerk gripped the counter like he expected the floor to fall out from under him. "It can't be," Raj said, but Oscar could barely hear him over the roar of angry customers. He looked at Oscar like he was begging him to lie and tell him it was all just a joke. There was enough for them. They wouldn't walk away empty-handed. It couldn't possibly be that Oscar had come so far for another almost. But Oscar looked at the petrified face of the clerk. What reason would he have for lying now? More than that, what reason would he have for angering a crowd already on the brink of revolt? The seed of disappointment was sprouting its roots in Oscar's stomach as the scene before him played out in slow motion. He pictured himself walking away with Raj and Isaac, circling the mall and dragging their feet back to the bus stop, unable to find the words to express this particular brand of letdown, unable to describe how it wasn't the plush-trap chaser. Not really. It was the confirmation that people like him weren't meant to hope for things. While the clerk stood with his hands up, like his trembling palms could somehow comfort the angry masses, Oscar drifted to the side of the counter and tried to process yet another disappointment. He felt cut off from the scene around him, until a few intriguing words lured his attention away from the crowd's raucous protests, and the clerk's weak responses. "Call police!" a woman's voice said. "Who? Processed. Return!" a gruff man's voice demanded. "Real!" a squeaky teenager's voice said. "Human?" the woman asked. Oscar inched past the counter and peered around a few stacks of cardboard boxes. Just beyond the boxes, 3 employees clustered around something Oscar couldn't see. Though their backs were mostly to Oscar, he was far enough from the crowd now that he could hear the employees discussing whatever it was they were looking at. No doubt about it. They look Real, said a teenage staffer as he hunched over the thing. They're sure not from the manufacturer, said a man gruffly, who Oscar guessed to be the greedy manager, judging by his authoritative tone. How do you know? Asked a third employee, her low ponytail slung over her shoulder, as she knelt beside the teenagers. Did anyone look at this one before it was sold? Someone would have noticed, wouldn't they? The teenager asked. I still think we should call the police, the woman in the ponytail said, her voice lowering so that Oscar had to strain to hear her. And say what? Said the teenager. Hey, we think we've got a situation here. See, someone returned a toy, and, funny story, now the toy looks too lifelike. Help, officer, help! Keep your voice down, scolded the maybe manager. I mean, they can't actually be real, can they? The woman asked. The other two said nothing, and as though on cue, all three stepped away from the thing they were crowding around, and Oscar could finally see what they were examining. There, on top of a small work table, sat a mangled box that looked like it had been rescued from a trash compactor. Its cellophane window was dingy, with white crease marks spread like veins across the front. The corners of the box were soft and worn, and the top flap was held together by a fuzzy strip of packing tape. But even through all this damage, Oscar could see a green head and bulging eyes. A plush trap chaser! Beyond Oscar, the crowd's unhappiness crescendoed into a roar, and the clerk suddenly appeared behind the boxes. He didn't notice Oscar. He was too panicked. Help! The clerk shouted at the other employees. They're about to revolt! Before they turned, Oscar slipped back around the boxes. No longer eavesdropping on the employees, he ran to his friends, who were still pressed against the counter. The woman appeared beside the register and the panicked clerk. Her name tag said she was Tanya, assistant manager. I'm very sorry, Tanya called out, but the plush trap toy is now out of stock. No, it isn't, Oscar said, too quietly at first, and it was impossible to hear over the tumultuous crowd. When Tanya didn't respond, he shouted, Hey! She turned to him, her dark eyes intense. What? She snapped. You have one back there, Oscar said. Maybe he accused. He pointed to where he knew the plush trap chaser was, behind the stacks of boxes. Tanya shot another look at the crowd, then glanced in the direction Oscar was pointing. She stared that way a little too long, then looked at Oscar like they were suddenly the only two people in the store. That one's damaged, she said. It looks fine to me, Oscar lied, pressing his luck. He wasn't sure what Tanya and the other employees had been talking about, but he was smart enough to know something weird happened to the returned plush trap chaser. He didn't care, though. His need for the toy was all-consuming. It's not fine, kid. It's, defective. Tanya crossed her arms. Trust me, you don't want that one. But it's not for sale, Tanya said through gritted teeth, before yelling into the crowd. Folks, I'm sorry, okay? I'm sure we'll get some more at some point. Then she grumbled to herself. We'd better. When will that be? Demanded a woman in a shirt that said, Keep calm and dance on. I don't... What am I supposed to tell my daughter? A guy in a suit and tie asked. Sir, you must... Your clerk said you had plush traps for everyone, hollered a lady so close to Oscar, his ear rang with her shrill echo. I doubt he... The crowd was on the verge of mutiny, but Oscar barely registered them. Dude, we better get out of here, Isaac said. No joke, said Raj. My mom dragged me to some sale on bedsheets once. When they ran out, I actually saw this one lady bite someone. They were out for blood. Isaac looked at Raj in horror. I don't want to get bit. But Oscar was still only half listening. I don't care if it's damaged.
I'll bite anyway, he said to Tanya, but the crowd was too loud for her to hear him. She was unwinding the cord on the intercom. People, please calm down! She yelled into the microphone as feedback pierced the air, making everyone pause for a moment to cover their ears. But that only seemed to rile them up more, and soon customers were shoving and flooding the store, tearing toys off the shelves, as they looked for hidden plush trap chases, like they were on some sort of demented Easter egg hunt. That's it! I'm calling security! Tanya yelled, then traded the microphone for the tan receiver under the cash register. I don't get paid enough for this. Come on, let us just buy the one you have back there, Oscar persisted. It was too much. The thought of leaving after coming this close. He couldn't bear it. Get lost, kid! Tanya yelled over her shoulder before pressing the receiver to her ear. Where's Mr. Stanley? Tell him I need some help over here, she said into the phone. Then Tanya turned her back on the counter. Oscar didn't think. If he'd been thinking, he never would have run around the counter and behind the stacks of boxes. He never would have shoved aside the teenage employee and the maybe manager who stood gaping at the crumpled 3-foot box standing between them. He wouldn't have hoisted it up, accidentally clipping the teenage staffer in the chin while the clerk and Tanya yelled for Oscar to stop, to wait, to put it down. If he'd been thinking, Oscar would have answered Raj and Isaac when they suddenly appeared beside him, asking him what the heck he was doing. In that moment, the only thing bouncing around Oscar's head were Mr. Devereaux's words. The point is, quit tilling, it's time to pick. Oscar slammed that pile of pooled cash on top of the work table. He clutched the long, narrow box to his chest, turned, and ran around the counter. Then he dropped his shoulder to plow through the crowd that barely took notice of him. So invested they were in their own mayhem. Stop! Stop! Yelled the employees. But Oscar was already to the front door of the Emporium, which was suddenly clear now that the crowd had moved inside. Dude, what are you doing? Called Raj. But he was nearly beside Oscar, so it was clear that whatever he was doing, he wasn't doing it alone. Oscar could hear Isaac's short legs working double time to keep up behind them. That way! The clerk yelled, still too close to Oscar to be comfortably far away. They took it! They stole it! Stop! Yelled another voice, and this one somehow sounded more authoritative. Oh man, it's security! Isaac wheezed, and suddenly he was faster than Oscar and Raj, sprinting ahead of them and leading the way out of the mall, the east entrance now in sight. We're dead, Raj said, but he was keeping pace with Oscar. We're so incredibly dead! Oscar couldn't say anything. He could hardly process what his body was doing. His mind had completely left the building. Suddenly, Isaac swerved, and it only took Oscar a second to see why. Emerging from a restroom doorway to the right was a confused mall security guard hiking up his pants, watching the scene in front of him unfold with slow recognition of the problem. Oscar and Raj sped past him just as the guard behind them yelled, Stop them! The east entrance glowed ahead like a beacon of safety, and Isaac burst through the door first, holding it while swinging his arm to Oscar and Raj. Hurry up! Hurry up! Hurry up! Oscar and Raj raced through, and the boys ran like a speeding arrow, Isaac at the head, while they made a hard right toward the private eucalyptus grove. But the parking lot was a wide expanse of obstacles before the trees. Isaac hesitated, and Oscar took the lead, weaving past minivans and SUVs like they were playing a human arcade game, the obstacles in security uniforms likely to come out of every corner. Except it was still only
the two voices Oscar could hear behind them. And when he ventured a brief look over his shoulder, it was indeed still just the two, and at least the one from the restroom doorway looked like he was starting to run out of steam. "Get," he huffed between strides. "Back! Here! We're losing them! Come on!" Oscar finally said, his voice sounding like someone else's. It was like he'd left his body entirely, and this thieving, criminal escape artist had taken him over. He wasn't Oscar. In this moment, he wasn't anyone he recognized. "We're almost there," Raj gasped, and they all knew he meant the eucalyptus grove. The menthol air was upon them, and the strong smell coated the inside of Oscar's burning lungs. "That's private property!" Oscar could hear the other security guard yell, but he sounded farther away now. It was almost like he was telling himself that, not Oscar, so he wouldn't have to chase the boys once they'd crossed the tree line. Oscar threw the box over the fence and followed it, tumbling to the ground and rolling through the leaves that had begun to shed now that fall was here. Isaac tumbled over the fence next, followed by Raj, and they took one more collective look through the slats in the fencing to confirm what Oscar already knew. The security guards had abandoned their pursuit, with the larger one resting his hands on his knees while he bent, huffing and spitting. The boys weren't done running, though. It was private property, and they shouldn't be there either. But it was more than that. It was wrong. They knew everything about what they'd just done was wrong, especially what Oscar had done. Instead of facing that, he tried to outrun it. He ran all the way to his street, even as Raj and Isaac pleaded with him to slow down, that the danger was over, that he was being crazy. They pleaded angrily, in fact, and Oscar knew that maybe it was because he'd gotten them into this mess. He'd been the one to grab the plush trap chaser. He'd been the one to run like a bear was chasing him. He'd been the one to make them decide to run with him, or leave him to his own terrible decision and all of its consequences. When they finally arrived at Oscar's house, lungs burning and neck sweating, their legs shaking hard enough to be useless, they collapsed on the floor of Oscar's small living room, splayed in a circle around the 3-foot-long box that was damp with perspiration and decorated with stuck-on dead leaves. Technically it wasn't stealing, Oscar said, fast to regain his breath and possibly his wits. "You're an idiot," Isaac said, and he meant it. "I left our money on the counter," Oscar said, but he knew it was laughable, and Raj punctuated that fact by laughing mirthlessly. "You're an idiot," Isaac said again, just to be sure it registered this time, and Oscar nodded. "Yeah, I know." This time, they did all chuckle. Not quite a laugh, and none of them meant it, but it was enough for Oscar to know that even though they hated what he did, they didn't hate him. And besides, now they had a plush-trap chaser, regardless of how they got it. But now that he could catch his breath, Oscar had time to reflect on the hushed conversation he'd heard between the Emporium employees. What was it they'd said? Something about the parts looking too real? It was hard to see why that would be a problem. The more lifelike the better, right? Still, the way they'd all backed away from the toy, something definitely wasn't right about it. Raj and Isaac knelt next to him. They were staring at the illegally obtained plush-trap chaser. Raj glanced up at Oscar. "Are we going to open it?" Were they? They'd come this far. Was Oscar really going to let some disgruntled employees at the saddest toy store on Earth keep him from the plush-trap chaser now, after he'd finally seized the day, after he'd finally plucked the fruits of all his labors? "Dude, are we opening this thing or not?" asked Raj. "Okay," Oscar said. "Let's see what this beast can do." It took some doing to get the thing out of its box. The molded plastic case that should have formed a protective shell over the toy had been crushed along with the rest of the packaging, and was now almost one with the toy itself, the plastic wedged into every joint of the rabbit's arms and legs. The twist ties that secured it to the mold had bent to hard knots that needed to be carefully unwound, and between the smeared and tired marked lettering, the instructions were essentially illegible. Once the boys had finally freed it from its packaging, Oscar stood the plush trap chaser on its oversized feet and straightened the joints at the knees to stabilize it. The toy was relatively light considering the machinery that had to be behind it. The heaviest parts of the rabbit were its weighed feet, presumably for ease of movement and balance, and head, presumably for ease of chomping. I don't know why, but it's not exactly how I imagined it, Raj said. Oscar and Isaac were quiet, which meant silent, if reluctant, agreement. They didn't mean it in a snobbish way, though. Oscar had received more than his share of lightly damaged or refurbished toys, the byproduct of having more wants than money. And though Raj and Isaac could afford more, they never held that over Oscar's head. It was more like nothing could possibly live up to the hype that had preceded the release of this toy that, let's face it, didn't do much of anything. It ran fast, and it chomped fast. The simplicity, the plainness of its functionality had appealed to Oscar, but more than that, the plush trap was wanted. It was what only the unlucky, the consistently passed over, would have to go without. Oscar couldn't be that kid again. He just couldn't. Is it just me, or do the teeth look wrong? Isaac pointed at the straight, slightly yellow, human-looking teeth that were visible through Plush Trap's partly open mouth. No doubt about it, they look real. Oscar had to admit the teeth looked a little off. Definitely not like the ones he'd seen in the ads, or in the one he saw Miss Beasley buy. Yeah, they're not pointed, Raj said. Why aren't they pointed? Oscar didn't volunteer anything. They're not pointed, but they're creepy, Oscar said. They look... He swallowed. Human. Yeah, Raj said. They do. Weird. And what's with the eyes? Isaac said. He reached out and poked one of the cloudy green eyes. Ew! He whipped his hand back and flicked his finger. It's squishy! There was no denying it. Whatever was wrong with this plush trap chaser's teeth and eyes was definitely what the employees were discussing in the back of the store. Still, Oscar thought, there's no way the parts could be real. He'd seen the eyeball when Isaac touched it, though. There was the tiniest give, like if he'd pressed on a peeled grape. There was no tap from his fingernail like there should have been on hard plastic. And then there were the teeth. That's why they were so freaked out, Oscar mumbled, and he only realized he'd said that last bit aloud when Raj and Isaac turned to stare at him. This is my punishment, Oscar thought. I just need something to pry it open, he said, trotting to the kitchen to grab a butter knife from the drawer. When he returned, he jammed the flat end of the knife into the partially opened mouth. But when he pressed on the knife, the thin metal gave suddenly, and the tip of the knife broke off inside the rabbit's mouth. The pointed end seemed to be stuck in its weird teeth. Whoa, Raj said. Tell me it didn't take a bite out of a knife. It didn't.